The Gilded Age was a time of extravagant luxury and opulence, but the valleys of people living in the Gilded Age are in part to blame for the quality of life in lower social classes and the tragic sinking of the Titanic. The Gilded Age was a time of excess and fortune for many people because of the rapid industrialization that had just taken place at the turn of the century. New technologies were suddenly becoming more popular, and inventions that would change the country, such as bridges, canals, and skyscrapers, and much more, persuaded many immigrants to move to the United States in search of a better future. There were many factors that contributed to the deep divide between the upper and lower classes of the Gilded Age, but one event that demonstrates separation of the United States is the Civil War. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States was in a state of chaos. The Southern economy crumbled, and as Northerners evolved and developed a deeper, stronger workforce, the South was left behind. This same idea of one country being divided because of economy and workforce would translate into the separation based on social status and wealth in the Gilded Age. As more and more people immigrated, large factories began opening up to support the cycle of supply and demand due to the growing population. These factories were part of huge monopolies, usually owned by some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world. Some of the most famous names in United States history, like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt, all came from this moment in history. As immigrants flowed into the United States in search of a better life, they were met with prejudice against poor people. The justification that was widely accepted for the gap between upper and lower classes of the Gilded Age was the concept of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was the belief that the most successful people were successful because they were stronger and they had already possessed the skills that they needed to be successful. However, the poor people did not have the skills that they needed and therefore were weaker humans. The Titanic provided an opportunity for the upper class to travel in style and maintain their status. The Titanic itself was specifically constructed to be a demonstration of power by its creators, the White Star Line. White Star Line was a shipping company based out of Liverpool, United Kingdom from 1845 to 1934. The Cunard Line was a government-backed shipping company also in England at the same time as the White Star Line. The chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, had a large ego and believed that he had to compete with the Cunard Line to be the best and most magnificent shipping company in England. Ismay set out to build a ship that would dwarf all ships built by the Cunard Line and would be the pinnacle of the White Star Line. J. Bruce Ismay set out to construct the Titanic. Constructed of 46,328 tons of steel and stretching over 880 feet long, the Titanic was the largest ship ever constructed at the time. This was to be the pride and joy of the White Star Line, and in order for that to happen, its luxury and size could not be matched by any other shipping company. It was designed to be the most luxurious ship that had ever sailed, but because the Titanic was constructed around its sheer size, it was not completely practical. One example of how the Titanic was built more for looks than for practicality were the funnels on the top of the ship. Photos of the Titanic show 4 funnels running down the length of the ship to take care of ventilations for the boiler rooms that were burning over 600 tons of coal per day. This magnificent ship did not actually need all 4 funnels to function properly. It later became known that the 4th funnel was added because that was the way that Cunard Line designed their ships, and the White Star Line did not want to seem inferior for having fewer parts. Aside from the frivolous aesthetic changes made to the ship, there were some legitimate construction flaws that would contribute to the horror of the ship sinking. The Titanic was built with a set of 15 bulkheads running down the length of the ship. These bulkheads were designed to be strong and they could seal shut in the case of an emergency, but one major flaw cost 1,500 people their lives. Although they were strong and could be closed off from the rest of the ship, the walls that separated them from each other were only 10 feet high and did not reach the ceiling, meaning that if and when water did get into one of the bulkheads, there was nothing to stop it from flowing over the top of the compartment and flooding the other 14. Even though the ship could physically handle the flooding of up to 4 bulkheads, this only brought the passengers a little bit of time when the ship struck the famous iceberg. The ideas of social Darwinism and the prejudice that many people had against the lower classes also made this night more terrible than it had to be. Aboard the Titanic, passengers were split up into 3 classes: first, second, and third. The 329 first-class passengers paid as much as £870, which is worth about £49,624 today, and enjoyed some of the most ornately decorated, largest, and luxurious rooms. The 285 second-class passengers paid around £12, worth about £684 today, and still enjoyed fine rooms aboard the ship. However, the 710 third-class passengers paid anywhere from £3 to £8, worth about £171 to £456 today, and stayed in rooms that were tiny compared to the other classes. The third-class passenger also did not have access to some parts of the ship, and they were not treated the same ways as other people. On April 14, 1912, at roughly 11:40 p.m., a 150-foot iceberg tore a gash 1/3 of the length of the Titanic. There was no alarm set off and no warning from the crew because they did not want to start a panic. Curious passengers stumbled out of their rooms, barely dressed for the frigid temperatures, to investigate, and they were met with an overwhelming fear. But not everybody got the chance to know what was going on. The third-class passengers with rooms below deck were detained and were never even given the chance to escape the doomed ship because first and second classes had priority. There was a ship-wide realization of the imminent danger, and many of the passengers' true colors showed as violence broke out on the ship. As men, women, and children all panicked on the decks, the first of only 20 lifeboats was lowered into the water, with only 19 people in it. The first people to be allowed into the lifeboats were the women and children of the first class. Even in the middle of a life-or-death situation for thousands, the common values of the Gilded Age had an impact on people's decisions. The lifeboats had a capacity of 65 people, but the crew and passengers had not had the proper drills to inform them on the procedures that they should take, and they were more concerned with being uncomfortable than the lives of others. As underfilled lifeboats continued to be lowered into the water, there were multiple shots fired on deck, and chaos broke out as panic set in. In addition to not having enough lifeboats to save everyone, life vests were also not being distributed to everyone who needed them. Distress signals were sent out to all the nearest ships, and flares were shot into the air in vain. The last distress signal went out at 12:27 a.m., and in response, the Virginia, the Olympic, and the Baltic all raced to the scene of the tragedy in hopes of rescuing the hundreds of stranded passengers. Survivor James B. McGough recalled the events of that night when he said, "For a time we bobbed about on the ocean, then we started to row slowly away. I shall never forget the screams that flowed over the ocean toward us from the sinking ship. At the end, there was a mad rush and a scramble. The Titanic sank beneath the eerily calm surface of the water and to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at 2:20 a.m., April 15, 1912. After the Titanic sank, less than 700 people were stranded in the lifeboats, desperately awaiting help, when 1,178 people could have fit in the boats if they had been filled. More than 1,500 people had either gone down with the ship or were left to drown. 1,550 people died that night in the biggest shipwreck history had ever seen. Only 713 people survived. The common values of the Gilded Age heavily influenced the construction, decoration, operation, and idea of the Titanic. The White Star Line was more concerned with their ego than the safety of their passengers, and as a result, their cocky attitude would lead to their eventual downfall. But perhaps it was not entirely their fault. This attitude was exactly how they became one of the most well-known and respected shipping lines of the Gilded Age, the age that truly valued wealth, status, and luxury. As said in the article 1910's The Way We Lived, the ship was a symbol of an industrial age and an emblem of the power of the British Empire. However, the fame of the Titanic before it sailed was nothing compared with the following its maiden voyage. Retold in numerous books, documentaries, and films, the story of the Titanic has become a modern folk tragedy, a warning against pride and overconfidence. It is also a fable of lost dreams, dignified bravery, and greedy self-interest.